discussion board 4, a lot to do with identity and a lot of questions and perhaps a lot to say. So let's get on to the first question. And uh, first question is Laiali. Do you think people can learn more about a culture through a sports team? Yes, I think they can do. The point being, I think, here is we learn about culture through the different smaller discourse communities that people are a member of. And it's the accumulation of these memberships that tend to create larger, more national identities of culture. So, yeah, sports team or any discourse community where you can see how people operate in face to face situations and the norms by which they conduct themselves, the kinds of collective memories they have, and the kinds of imaginings they have about the future. Levi says, well, Levi gives talks a lot about his involvement in a sports team when he was younger and how important that was to him. And I think it's essential that we do experience this feeling, the powerful feeling of teamwork, of being part of a team with a common set of goals. We probably most experience it when we're in a team, a sports team, but it could also be in a work situation, or it could be in the military, which is often a very um, um, important experience for a lot of people, and where you have a very common bond between each other and you have a very common purpose. But hopefully, we can, throughout our lives, still feel the power of being a part of a team. Alex C. says, is running towards a ref, which is seen by Sir Alex Ferguson as typical German, seen typically as different culture in another country? For example, would Spanish players think running towards a ref is also typically German? I don't think so. I think it's a particularly British or English stereotype about how Germans behave. And of course, it contradicts the British stereotype of themselves as being great respecters of the ethics of sport, of the notion of sportsmanlike behavior, of being amateurs rather than professionals. So, yeah, I think it's an English projection of a stereotype upon the Germans. And it's not something that the Spanish would do. They would have a different stereotype of Germans. Um, Alex Case says, what would you call the opposite of linguicism? For example, if somebody likes you only because you can speak a certain language. What I would say is that it's still a form of linguicism. So linguicism is discrimination, and usually it's discrimination against people because they speak a particular language or variety of a language which is not considered to be which is was not appreciated, which is uh, and so the opposite of that, in a sense, would be where a person speaks a particular language or variety of a language which is greatly appreciated or praised, right? So an example of that would be myself when I first came to this country, and I had more of a British accent, and people actually thought I was intelligent because I spoke with this particular accent. And then the further west I went, the more intelligent I became. And when I got to California, I was just a total genius. Of course, people quickly found out that the way I spoke had nothing to do with the kind of intelligence I had. But this is still a form of linguicism, that one particular type of language is prized above another, and if you don't conform to it, then you are not given you're not as fairly treated. Every country has particular prestige accents. If you go to Italy, the prestige variety would be spoken, say, in Florence. If you go to Spain, it would be that which is spoken in Madrid, Castilian Spanish. Um, in this country, if you go to not long ago, I don't think it's the case now, that the standard variety of spoken American for TV and radio announcers was based upon the Cleveland area variety of English, and that was considered to be the standard pronunciation. I don't think it's the case now, but every country has particular varieties which are privileged, and people give more respect to those particular varieties, which become standard, quote unquote, standard. Um, Terrell says something that I find intriguing is the subjectivity involved in cultural identity. In the US, people are classified racially and ethnically in a manner specific to the United States. In a literal sense, African American is two nationalities being used to describe an entire race of people who may vary vastly. In another country, this classification may not even be a feasible description of what they consider the race to be. This makes me wonder why and what it is that quantifies groups to people in general. I don't quite know what you mean by quantifies there. Um, but I think I can get what you mean. I think African American is a very specific term that is used in the United States, and it has a history to its development, and it tends to map over with other hyphenated Americans, Italian Americans, Mexican Americans, Japanese Americans. Um, and it's not something that can be used in other situations. So if we talk about the ex slave communities in South America or the Caribbean, we can't really describe them as being African American. For example, if um, somebody from Jamaica who originally was of African descent migrates to England, to Britain, the term that's it's not, we can't describe that person as African American. So these are terms that are very particular to particular societies, right? In talking about our race, the actual concept of being white is something of which historically has always changed. Originally, being white was considered to be based upon, say, Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian. That was the particular ideal. And so people who, like the Irish, the Italians, the Greek, were not considered to be white at particular stages in the history of this country. So our notions of what is black, what is white, are shifting all the time. Jacob says, are there parts of your identity that you never thought about until this lecture? I think there's parts of identity which are important to us and we're conscious of. For example, the way we wear our hair, our sexuality, the clothes we wear, music we listen to, uh, are very important to us at particular times of our lives. We're not always conscious of other elements of our identity, such as religion and ethnicity, what region of the United States we come from, for example. And these become less important until we're placed in situations where they do become important. So our identity is made up of lots of different particular subsections, which may be important at a particular time or a particular place, but then um, they other particular parts of the identity may become important when we move to a different place, we get a job, or as we go older. Nick says, in reference to dispute my comment, is it possible to fully lose your original way of speaking, or is this ingrained in our subconscious in a way that will always have some of our unique speech leak through? A nice expression. I think I get what you mean there. Uh, Often it's to do with identity, and as we grow, as we age, our identity changes, and so forth. So our particular accent changes as well. It may be that we want to get as far away from that original accent as possible because that is not something which is our identity anymore. And so for that reason, um, we can get away from it. But again, there are certain situations and certain topics. Uh, when you're talking about a particular topic, you might be particular elements of your original accent that come through. So if you want to hear my Manchester accent, then let's talk about Manchester. Let's talk about football in Manchester, and then gradually you'll hear more of my original accent. Michael says, I think that one's identity has a big role in culture. The actress from the show, Jane the Virgin, is Puerto Rican and she doesn't have a heavy accent. There are hateful comments towards her saying that she isn't a real Latina. So, what does the real identity of a real Latina have? A heavy accent? Yeah, probably. Um, so, there's a picture of Sofia Vergara from Modern Family. And part of her identity in the show, and I think it's something that she goes beyond the show, is that she does have this heavy accent. There's a nice article in the there. You can see the link for it, and there's also a little video by her son about a little spoof video about the way she actually speaks. Um, so yeah, I think she's probably very conscious of the fact, and she talks about her accent getting thicker as she gets older too. Um, so if you play a particular role like she does, and it's all part of being this sexy Latina woman, that she has to have a heavier accent. Notice that her hair tends to be darker than what it is. She's a blonde, but the notion, the idea of a Latina is not somebody who has blonde hair. So in many ways, she's falling into a particular social construction of what a Latina woman is like. Here's an interesting comparison with the actress Gillian Anderson, and there's a nice link at the bottom there to a YouTube which has captures two interviews that Gillian Anderson is giving, one on American TV and one on British TV, and you can notice the way her accent changes. In the American one, she speaks as American, and the British one, she speaks as a Brit, and that is a reflection of her upbringing. So if you have a look at a little bio there from Wikipedia. So Anderson's born in this country, in Chicago, but then she moved to Puerto Rico. I guess the biggest influence on her was then she moved to London, England, and she lived there for until she was 11. And that's a critical period in terms of obtaining an authentic accent. Um, so she went to school there until she was 11, and then their family moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan. Okay, but she did go back to London because they had a flat there, so she spent summers there. So she's bidialectal, and what you find with her is that she switches from American to British English depending on the particular context, who she's talking to. Mitchell says, has anyone been in a situation where they notice the change of accents in a rapid time period? Can you think of specific example that has been encountered at Ohio University? Um, it may well be. I don't know any particular example. Well, the best examples, of course, are with second language speakers who, once they come to a country where the English is spoken, for example, they very quickly develop a much better accent. Maybe not an authentic accent because there are critical periods in terms of acquiring an authentic accent. But you do hear those kinds of changes. And I should also think there are some students also who come from different regions who may begin to change their accents to fit in with the predominant Ohio accent that's spoken in Ohio University, and probably also Southeast Appalachian inflections of American English too. Cameron says Gula is strongly influenced by African oral tradition. What cultural language will develop out of our time? Other already languages like Nadsat, that's the fictional slang language from Anthony Burgess's novel A Clockwork Orange. Nadsat, by the way, is um, Anthony Burgess is a linguist. He's a Russian scholar, so Nadsat is a Russian-influenced English. So we can see that all over the world in terms of varieties of English, certainly. Um, what's important here is that we develop ways of speaking which are part of our group identity. This is especially true of younger people. They don't want to speak like their mother and father because they want to create their own identity, and they want to create a sense of a group in a group membership. So they speak in certain ways. They're going to develop ways of speaking certain ways which mark others themselves as part of the group and exclude other people because they don't understand what they're talking about. And I know that's very true of my children who speak in particular ways which they know that we don't understand, their mother and father don't understand. So that's a common continual process of younger people creating new ways of speaking, right? Which identify them as a particular group and keep other people out. Karl says, can anybody answer number 5 for me? If it is possible, thank you. Karl, I think that's the second time you've asked somebody to ask a question, answer a question. Nick Holmby describes how he changed the way he spoke from a middle-class accent to an inner-city working-class accent. Have you ever experienced a similar change in accent that accompanied an identification with a particular group? Well, yeah, my own particular accent has changed over many years. Um, I came to move to this country permanently in 1987. And I became an American citizen about 3 years ago. And most definitely, my particular accent has changed because my identification is with being a member of this society, not a member of English society or British society. So yeah, my accent has changed, and that happens to all of us. If you're very fortunate in later life to listen to a recording of yourself when you're younger, you'll notice that your particular speech style has changed. Peter says, what do we know about the neuroscience side of code switching? What processes are involved in code switching and what makes it so confusing, difficult sometimes? I can't really speak to very much about the neuroscience of code switching. I mean, the one reason neurologists are interested in looking at code switching and bilingualism is to discover the locations of language in the brain and how different little languages are situated together and the kinds of links between the two. Um, what's more important, I think, is the social reasons for code switching. Again, it's a form of identification. It's a form of marking someone who's part of that particular group who understands the code switching, and it's marks. It has an ability to exclude other people who are not part of it. Um, it's very interesting that in any form of language learning, and you've probably done this yourself, you play around with the language in terms of code switching. So it's kind of also a sense of play that is going on. Um, Other things to think about, which go beyond, say, code switching, is the notion of language switching, where we use different languages to talk about different topics. So, for example, most people in the world who post on Facebook or in social media are probably going to be using English. That is, that they have a first language they use in other situations, but they will probably find themselves posting. Um, on social media in English. So that's the notion of language switching. Depending on the topic of conversation, you change the language. Um, Here's John. It is crazy to take into account what makes up our identity. Honestly, I believe our society to be so judgmental. That's right. That in some cases it causes people to want to hide or cover up their identity. Certainly, because there are certain kinds of identities which are not permitted. We know that in the history of the United States in the last 10, 20 years, the incredible change in terms of the acceptance of a gay or lesbian identity. And now, of course, the debate is about transgender identity. There's always been a long history of racial identity that you can flip between the two. That um, uh, being of one racial identity might not benefit you, so you hide that part of your identity, and then you proceed to another identity. Um, and just to finish up what you're saying here, could one say they are born with their identity? It's an interesting question, isn't it? And um, the the kind of answer would be something which appears in Siddhartha Mukherjee's new book, The Gene, and I would suggest you have a look at it, or at least have a look at the interview with Terry Gross there. And Mukherjee has quite a lot to say about genes and identity. Um, um, and of course, what he would would say is that, of course, genes um, influence our identity, and of course they don't. Um, um, what makes us unique as individuals is that our particular way that our genes affect us is quite distinct in many ways, right? And he talks about that particular thing, and it's especially interesting in terms of sexual orientation and gender, um, the interplay with genes, um, and not that it determines the way we are, but that it's an interaction between genes and other social forces. Okay, thank you for those questions, and I'll talk to you again here with discussion board 5.